Okay, we're going to get started now. So welcome and thank you all for coming to the launch of Human Rights Watch's 2021 World Report. My name is Emma Daly and I'm the Acting Chief Communications Officer at Human Rights Watch and your moderator today. In a moment, I will ask Ken Roth, our Executive Director, to talk to us about global trends in human rights and our World Report. But of course, before we get started, we have a few important Zoom housekeeping announcements. Ken will be speaking in English. You have the option of listening to the English or selecting Spanish interpretation, which you can choose at the bottom of your screen. Please note that once you choose the language, you'll hear this press conference only in that language. As you can see, we also have international sign language interpretation, as well as closed captioning for anyone who needs it. So you're all aware, this press conference is recorded and being broadcast live on YouTube. Ken will make some remarks and then we will open it up for questions. So in order to accommodate the language interpretation, we'd like to ask that you submit your questions in writing through the Q&A function. I'll then read the question to Ken so that he or others on the call can answer it. Please identify yourself by name and media affiliation when you ask your question. You can ask in both Spanish or English. Those in Spanish will be translated into English and then answered in both languages. Before I hand over to Ken, I do want to welcome several other colleagues joining us on the call. US Executive Director Nicole Austin Hillary, whose team covers domestic human rights issues in the US. Washington Director Sarah Holowinski, who oversees US foreign policy work. And America's Director Jose Miguel Vivanco. They're on the call to answer questions really specific to their area of expertise. After this, Jose Miguel will also host a Zoom call to discuss human rights news in Latin America in more detail. We're posting the Zoom link to that call in the chat at this press conference in case you want to join. And now I'm going to hand over to our Executive Director, Ken Roth.
Okay, well, thank you, Emma. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to present this year's annual Human Rights Watch World Report. And as has become typical, this report reviews recent developments over the last year in more than 100 countries where Human Rights Watch regularly operates. Now, in addition to these country-specific chapters, every year we highlight an overarching theme of global importance. And frankly, there was little choice this year but to spotlight the presidential transition in Washington. And so that's what I'm going to talk about briefly this morning before opening it up to questions. Now, to sum it up, not to put too fine a point on it, Donald Trump was a disaster for human rights. His flouting of human rights at home and his embrace of friendly autocrats around the world severely eroded US credibility on human rights. So even though there was an occasional US condemnation of human rights in Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, sometimes China, these rang hollow when there was parallel praise bestowed on the likes of Russia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or Israel. Now, after 4 years of Trump's indifference and often hostility to human rights, the election of Joe Biden clearly presents an opportunity for fundamental change. But it's important to stress that a Biden presidency alone is not a panacea. In recent decades, we've seen that when each new president arrives in the White House, he brings a wild shift, radical oscillations in US policy. And so, what I'm hearing, what all of us hear from pro-rights leaders around the world is they're asking, how can they depend on Washington? How do we know that this all won't just go away in 4 to 8 years? And it's a fair question. Now, fortunately, many governments treated Washington's unreliability as cause for resolve rather than despair. They recognize that human rights are too important to abandon just because Trump did. And so even as China, Russia, their allies sought to undermine the global defense of human rights, a new series of coalitions of governments came to the defense of human rights. So just to cite an example, in Latin America, where traditionally governments didn't criticize each other's human rights records, that's something that Washington did. It was considered Yankee imperialism. That changed over the last 4 years when a series of Latin American democracies plus Canada joined together in what was known as the Lima Group to spearhead the defense of human rights in Venezuela. And we've seen similar evolution around the world. For example, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the currently 56 mostly Muslim majority nations, never went to the United States to defend human rights, never went to the United Nations, to defend human rights around any country other than Israel. But that changed with Myanmar's persecution of Rohingya Muslims, where these Muslim majority countries started to play a very important and positive role in defending the rights of the Rohingya. We saw a broad range of governments in Europe and beyond come together to condemn China's repression at home, to condemn Saudi Arabia for its repression, both at home and in Yemen. The European Union took the lead with respect to trying to pressure Hungary and Poland to reverse its autocratic trends and to pressure Belarus to allow a fair election. In the move that perhaps saved the most lives, Germany, France, and Turkey pressured the Russian government to stop targeting the 3 million civilians in Syria's Idlib province. And a broad range of governments even came together to stand up to Trump's unconscionable attack on the International Criminal Court simply because it wanted to investigate US torture in Afghanistan and Israeli war crimes in Palestine. Now, the growing number of governments involved in this defense of human rights ironically made it more robust, even without the United States. So one big lesson to Biden as he assumes the presidency is that he should seek to strengthen, not supplant, these broader collective efforts. Now, when it comes to China, an expanding coalition of governments overcame their traditional fear of economic retaliation from China and recognized Beijing's worsening repression, arguably the worst repression since the murderous crackdown on the Tiananmen Square democracy movement in 1989. Most recently, with Germany in the lead at the UN General Assembly in October, a record 40 governments came together to condemn Beijing's repression of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang. Now, traditionally, after each of these kind of common statements, China will organize a counter statement. It will reach out to the dictators and thugs of the world and ask them to applaud its repression. But the numbers of people willing to sign on to China's statements has been dropping. Just in the last year, it fell from 54 countries to 45, nearing parity with the number of governments willing to condemn China. And that's interesting because it means that for the first time, we may be facing the possibility at the United Nations of resolutions being passed that condemn China, something that has never happened so far. Also, if you look at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Muslim majority countries increasingly are frankly fed up with Beijing's repression of Muslims in Xinjiang. And again, we see more and more of these governments moving away from China, if not actively condemning what China is doing, at least refusing to take part in the charade of applause for that repression. Now, this evidence of mounting global disapproval of China was reflected also in October when China ran for a seat on the UN Human Rights Council. 4 years ago, when China ran for such a seat, it received the most votes of any candidate from the Asia-Pacific region. This year, it received the fewest number of votes other than Saudi Arabia, which was denied a seat, which was, of course, a good thing. So these important trends are clearly noticed in Beijing. The Chinese government cares deeply about its global reputation, both for reasons of legitimacy and, frankly, to fend off criticism of its repression. So this growing condemnation of Beijing, coupled with the emerging willingness to consider sanctions, to press for investigations, to insist that companies scrutinize their supply chains to ensure they're not complicit in forced labor, all of this is really raising the heat on Beijing. Biden should contribute to this trend by abandoning Trump's inconsistent, transactional, unilateral approach to China. Trump's approach basically discouraged other governments from joining him. They didn't want anything to do with his personal agenda. Instead, Biden should adopt a more principled, consistent, and multilateral approach to maximize the ability to change Beijing's conduct. Now, more fundamentally, Biden's big challenge is not simply to reverse Trump's damage to human rights, important as that is, but also to change the narrative on human rights in a more fundamental way, so that way it can better survive future changes of administration. Ironically, Biden has to start his presidency by thinking about the end of his presidency to ensure that the next president doesn't come in and simply reverse everything that he's done. Now, given the slight majorities that the Democrats now hold in both houses of Congress, some of this could be done by legislation, and we certainly encourage that. Ideally, we'd love to see treaties ratified, but getting 2/3 of the Senate to agree to that and bring the United States into line with most of the rest of the world is going to be difficult. Biden should certainly allow justice to pursue its course with respect to Trump, to show that no one is above the law, or as Biden recently put it, that the president is not a king. Now, there obviously are impeachment proceedings taking place right now. Likely by the end of the day, impeachment will be a reality. But it's important that Biden also allow criminal justice to occur. So Biden should not make the same mistake that Obama made when confronting torture under the Bush administration. He should not look forward, not back, as Biden said, leaving a precedent of impunity that only encourages more outrages. Instead, Biden should let professional prosecutors assess the evidence without political interference and to pursue prosecution of Trump wherever crimes are found to have been committed. Biden should not order prosecution. That would be seen as vindictive and personalized. He should just stand out of the way and let professional prosecutors do their work. And certainly, they should examine what happened last week, Trump's encouragement of a mob, including many white supremacists, to attack the Capitol. They should examine his calls to Georgia election officials, asking them to find 11,000 more votes. And they should be open to other crimes that Trump may have committed, whether his tax returns or his use of his office to advance his economic interests. Now, I recognize that some have argued that prosecuting Trump might be divisive in a difficult moment. But it's frankly more important to uphold the principle that even the president is subject to the rule of law. And frankly, I would hope that most people in the United States can find reconciliation around reasserting this important principle of the rule of law. Now, ultimately, Biden's goal should be to reshape public appreciation of human rights, to make it harder for a future administration to resume Trump's ways. And for inspiration, Biden should look back, of all people, to Jimmy Carter, who introduced human rights as an element of US foreign policy. Now, at the time, that was a radical step, but it struck a chord with the American people and it has endured. No president has ever been willing to formally abandon it, even if they follow it to lesser degrees. So Biden's challenge is to reshape public understanding of human rights in a similar way. And he can do that first at home by speaking more regularly about human rights, especially in the realm of economic and social rights, which traditionally the US government hasn't wanted to talk about in rights terms. But the pandemic provides an opportunity to change that, because Americans now understand the importance of economic and social rights. For example, when Biden tries to bolster access to healthcare, to expand Obamacare, as he said he would do, he should speak about that in rights terms, about the right of everyone to see a doctor without bankrupting their family. It's as simple as that. When he pushes for a new stimulus package for unemployment assistance, he should stress the right of everyone to put food on their table, to have a basic sustenance, even if they lose their job in the midst of a lockdown. This kind of more regular invocation of rights around issues that Americans care deeply about would help show the fundamental values involved and make it harder for the next administration, if it's so inclined, to do an about face. Now, with respect to US foreign policy, Biden should affirm that promoting human rights is not just an element of US foreign policy, the way Jimmy Carter did, but a guiding principle. That doesn't mean human rights always prevail, but they should be a very important consideration in all circumstances. And then to make that stick, he should follow that guiding principle even when it's politically difficult. That means transcending the double standards that so often have infected US foreign policy in the past. So for example, Biden might say, the US is no longer going to supply military aid or sell arms to systematically abusive governments. But then he should stick with that principle and stop arms sales or military aid to the likes of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, or Israel. He should be more outspoken about governments that systematically violate human rights, even if they're friendly. So for example, he should speak out about the government of Indian Prime Minister Modi and its encouragement of violence and discrimination against Muslims, even though India undoubtedly is going to be important in the coming contest with China. At the institutional level, Biden should re-embrace the UN Human Rights Council, which Trump abandoned because it criticized Israel. Trump should stop Biden's outrageous sanctions on the International Criminal Court prosecutor, even if he doesn't like the prosecutor's investigations of US torture or Israeli war crimes. In sum, turning the clock back 4 years is not going to be enough to undo Trump's damage. The world has changed, and so much the defense of human rights. So now that many nations have responded to Trump by assuming leadership roles themselves, Biden should seek to join that enhanced defense of rights, not supplant it. Meanwhile, Biden has to recognize that Trump magnified the traditional policy shifts between US administrations into a true crisis of credibility for the United States. Biden should seek to reframe public appreciation of human rights so the US commitment becomes entrenched in a way that his successors cannot so easily reverse it. That will also make it harder for some future president to resume Trump's attacks on US democracy. I'll conclude there, and I would welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Ken, for that illuminating introduction. Now we're going to take written questions, so please post those using the Q&A function, and please identify yourself and your outlet. I'm happy to say also that we've been joined by Human Rights Watch's UN Director, United Nations Director Lou Charbonneau, so he'll be available as well if we have any questions that go deep into UN policy. Ken, I'm going to start with a question from Twitter. With regards to, you've touched on this, but to speak a little bit more, with regards to the abuses unfolding in Xinjiang, China, what can the world actually do to stop this happening?
Okay, well, first, just so everybody's clear what's going on. I mean, China has detained over 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims to force them to abandon Islam, to abandon their culture. And it also increasingly is pushing these Muslims into forced labor as it establishes a very intrusive surveillance state throughout the region. Now, part of what has to happen is we need to continue this trend that we've seen over the last 2 years of governments banding together in growing numbers to condemn what's happening in Xinjiang. And it's particularly important to target the Muslim majority nations of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So far, only 3 Muslim majority countries have come out and actually condemned China: Albania, Bosnia, and Turkey. But there are many more that are sitting on the fence. I've spoken with many of them, and I think that they can be brought on board. China is very attentive to this kind of criticism, particularly from the global South. And if the US were to be a real partner in bringing on others, if France would do much more than it has to date, that could make a big difference in showing China how isolated it is. It's also, frankly, important to push for an investigation. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has been, I think, negotiating for 2 years maybe to send her team into Xinjiang, and nothing is happening. She needs serious backing. A genuine, independent, unfettered investigation would immediately force China to change its practices. And then Biden should support a strong version of the legislation that's kicking its way through Congress to require companies that source from China to ensure that their supply chains are not infected by forced labor. That's a basic duty as a matter of business compliance with human rights standards. But many companies are looking for weaker versions. Did they actually know? And the question is, how do you deal with this uncertainty? Right now, it's total uncertainty because China doesn't let anybody scrutinize anything. And so in that circumstance of uncertainty, the presumption today should be that the supply chain is infected. And with that presumption actually implemented, that would put enormous pressure on China to open up and to stop this horrible practice of detention and forced labor with respect to the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims.
Thanks, Ken. The next question is about the situation in Saudi Arabia. Why are human rights abuses still continuing despite all the international pressure? And what are you expecting President-elect Biden to do, or what do you think that President-elect Biden should do to improve the situation in Saudi Arabia?
It's true that there's been widespread condemnation of the Saudi crown prince's utter repression of any dissident voices, of women's rights activists, not to mention his bombing of civilians in Yemen, his government's murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But the Saudi crown prince has had a big friend in Washington, a powerful friend in Washington, in Trump, who you all remember the meeting in the White House with Trump holding his big photo showing, how many US jobs were going to be gained by the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. That's all that Trump cared about. He really could care less about the rights of the Saudi people, the lives of Yemeni civilians. Hopefully that changes. Congress already has come down in favor of cutting off arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So there's kind of an open door there for Biden to walk through. I hope he does. I hope that this is a big part of a more principled, more grounded commitment to human rights in Saudi Arabia. And I think that a Biden administration is really convinced that it's going to dedicate itself to human rights in Saudi Arabia, could also enlist European partners who themselves have often been more inclined to sell arms than to really put pressure on the Saudi crown prince. I think with sufficient pressure, the Saudi government is vulnerable, but it's a matter of really putting that pressure to bear.
Thanks. Given the news unfolding in Washington today, you won't be surprised to hear we have a question on an issue that you touched on a little in your introduction. But the question is, does Human Rights Watch have a view on the possible impeachment of President Trump?
I mean, look, at this point, impeachment is a foregone conclusion. I think by the end of the day, Trump will have been impeached for a second time. So I think the real issue is, what next? Probably the trial in the Senate won't take place until after January 20th. But we really are devoting ourselves at this point to Biden, because impeachment is, it's an important process. It's a political statement that a president went beyond the pale, but it's not a criminal inquiry. It doesn't assess whether criminality occurred. And if we really are to establish the rule of law, including over the president, if we really are going to show that the president is not a king, as Biden puts it, it's important that prosecutors be allowed to do their work, that justice is allowed to run its course. And I obviously worry about Biden because on the one hand, he sat at the table with Obama when Obama said, look forward, not back, with respect to the Bush torturers. Biden also is, by nature, a conciliator, and is not going to be eager for what he's going to see as the divisiveness of prosecutions. But as I said, it's essential to reestablish the rule of law. And I think that, while undoubtedly prosecutions would be controversial in certain corners, the American people as a whole, I think, would embrace the idea that we don't have a monarchical system in the United States, that the president is subject to the law, and if the president violates the law, whether in sending the mob off to attack Congress or, interfering with Georgia election officials, or, there's a long list, that he will be brought to justice, and that the next president, is not going to stand in the way just because he has a legislative agenda. I hope that that's what happens.
Thanks. And just a reminder, as you're posting your questions in the chat, please identify yourself and your outlet. I have one from Capsule, who asks, Human Rights Watch, and I think this may be one for Jose Miguel Vivanco. Human Rights Watch has raised concerns about Chile's anti-denial law, which we say contravenes international human rights standards. How would you compare this bill with anti-Holocaust and anti-fascism legislation in Germany and other parts of Europe? Because supporters of the Chilean bill say it was inspired by European laws. So I don't know which one of you would like to take the first stab.
I can try and answer. Well, last September, the Chilean House of Representatives passed a law, or a bill actually, that would punish people who justify or approve or deny human rights atrocities committed under Pinochet during the dictatorship, with up to 3 years in prison. The bill still needs to be approved by the Chilean Senate. There are similar laws actually in Europe, including in Germany. We have criticized these laws across the globe because they are run counter to human rights standards and are counterproductive to curb offensive speech. Objectionable and offensive speech should be countered with speech, not criminal punishment.
Thanks. Ken, anything to add, or?
Well, let me just add that I think that the analogy to the Holocaust denial laws are quite inapt, because, as Jose Miguel suggested, we shouldn't be using censorship to dictate a version of history. It's much better off to use debate and facts to demonstrate what happened. Now, the rationale for the anti-Holocaust laws, particularly in Germany, where there's obvious sensitivity, is that they're seen as anti-Semitic. It's not just a matter of historical truth, but Holocaust deniers are seen as basically making a comment about anti-Semitism. And I can understand that. You don't have that rationale when the issue is denying Pinochet's atrocities, or similar laws in Korea or elsewhere that have been adopted, where it's not as if any particular ethnic or religious group is being targeted. It's just a denial of atrocities. And that's wrong, it's despicable, but it should be answered with facts, with speech, not with censorship.
Thanks. The next question comes from Margaret Bashir, the Voice of America UN correspondent, who asks, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said this week he's open to a second term. How would you rate his performance on human rights, and what changes would you like to see in a likely second term? And Lou may want to join in and respond to that as well.
I'll start and then I'll hand it off to Lou. Look, Guterres has been disappointing on human rights. There's no other way to put it. We had great hopes and they've been dashed. And the main problem is that while Guterres is quite comfortable speaking in broad generic terms about human rights, I'm for women's rights, I'm for this rights, I'm for that rights, he rarely identifies a particular perpetrator. And so nobody feels the heat. If he says, I condemn summary executions, but doesn't say who's committing the summary executions, nobody feels the heat to stop. It's just a generic statement. And he says he prefers behind the scenes diplomacy, but public commentary doesn't preclude behind the scenes diplomacy. It's as if he's abandoning half the powers of his office. And so we would like to see a much greater willingness to use his voice by naming names, and not to shy away from the other powers of his office. For example, he didn't investigate the Saudi government's murder of Jamal Khashoggi, even though there was a glaring need for some definitive UN movement like that. So, the question of a second term is largely going to come down to the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. And I think this is an opportunity for them to press him he has issued this, call to action on human rights, but it's all call and no action. What does this mean beyond the rhetoric? And I think that now is the time to ask this. If he wants a second term, how is he going to do better on human rights? It's a very fair question to ask.
Lou?
Yeah, I would just say on the process that we believe that it should be an open, transparent, competitive process. The current Secretary General should not be handed a second term on a silver platter. In 2016, there was a very unique, transparent process where we saw debates among the candidates. They were public, there were questions asked of them. Just because there's an incumbent doesn't mean that we should toss transparency into the garbage. And the fact is, if they don't follow the precedent, if they don't create a precedent based on what happened in 2016, the risk is that it will be gone and we'll go back to smoke-filled room, closed door negotiations among the P5, and that's how it will be decided. If the Secretary General wants a second term, then he should stand up, defend what he's done, present a plan for what he intends to do better. And if he doesn't do that, then UN member states should think about whether it's time to move on. Basically, they should use this opportunity to ask whoever's going to be the next Secretary General to make clear where he stands on human rights. And this is a great opportunity to do so and to build on the transparency that was used in 2016.
Thanks, Lou. Ken, on a different topic that you also touched on briefly in your introduction, this is a question from Twitter. How have human rights challenges around the world changed in light of the COVID pandemic?
Well, as with so many things, there's good news and there's bad news, I suppose. I'll start with the bad news, being a human rights organization. But many governments seized upon the pandemic as the latest excuse to entrench their power and to suppress opposition. And we saw this, with Viktor Orban in Hungary, who, immediately declared dictatorial powers, the power to rule by decree without parliament, because he was going to be the great savior with respect to the pandemic, even though, he takes European Union funds, builds football stadiums with them to pay off his cronies, and leaves Hungarian hospitals in a decrepit state. Tomorrow, Uganda has a big election for president and parliament. President Museveni has used the pandemic as an excuse to quash the political rallies of his principal opponent, Bobi Wine, while allowing his rallies to go forward. These kinds of pretextual uses of the pandemic have been quite common. One thing we've learned is that public health requires the free flow of information and freedom to criticize the government's response in order to correct it and move in a more productive direction. And so an example where this has all gone wrong is in Egypt, where President Sisi has imprisoned doctors who criticize his poor response to the pandemic, with the result that he continues to shovel money at the army, his main backers, neglecting Egyptian hospitals. The worst case in many ways was right at the beginning of the pandemic in Wuhan, where for 3 weeks, the Chinese government censored the whistleblowing doctors who tried to warn us that the virus didn't come directly from the market exclusively, but it also is being transmitted from person to person. And by the end of those 3 weeks, millions of people had fled Wuhan, 3,500 a day traveled internationally, and we had a global pandemic. So that shows what happens when a government prioritizes its own political interests, self-preservation, over public health. And I think we've learned one is, if you want a real public health policy, you've got to insist on an open dialogue, on open flow of information. Now, on the positive side, I think the pandemic has shown us, in a corny sort of way, that we are all connected, that we can't just protect ourselves and neglect others. So if you allow racial minorities to be neglected, if you allow lower income people to be neglected, the virus flourishes there and then it moves. and it'll come back to haunt us. So I think we've seen that we need a universal right of access to healthcare. We need universal access to basic necessities when the economy is forced to slow down in times of adversity like this. And I think there's much greater public support for these innovations than had been the case in the past, at least within countries. And the next step is going to be to try to build similar support for international solidarity, which is still, I would say, a work in progress.
Well, just to follow up on that, there is a question from Thomas Billand who asks, how will Human Rights Watch support the Biden administration in achieving positive human rights change? And is there a realistic chance that the UN can help to deliver that change?
Well, that's kind of a big question. But obviously, in terms of global human rights policy, it's kind of what I just outlined before. We really want to encourage the Biden administration to treat human rights as a guiding principle, to mean it, to do this in a different way from the past, not just give it lip service, but live by it. And our sense is that if Biden really does entrench human rights as a more living, meaningful aspect of US foreign policy, then it's harder for this, oscillation to continue and for the next president to just throw out everything that the current administration had done in terms of human rights, as we've seen so often each time the presidency changes in Washington. With respect to the pandemic, it's obviously the World Health Organization that has been at the forefront of the response as for the United Nations. And Biden has already indicated that he will stop Trump's withdrawal from the WHO, which is the right thing to do. There are things he could do to help strengthen the WHO. The WHO, first of all, has problems of access. We see this right now where they're negotiating for a team to go back into China. And they're getting nowhere. The last investigation they had spent 8 days in the country. The Chinese government made them walk around irrelevant parts of China for 7 of those days. Only on the last day did they get to go to Wuhan, and they didn't get to talk to anybody of significance or see anything of significance. It was a complete show. And then WHO, parroted the party line with respect to, at that point, a relative lack, supposedly, of human-to-human transmission. So now Tedros is trying to bargain again, but is bargaining from a position of weakness. The US could help to make membership in the WHO require every member to issue an open invitation for investigators to come and look at their territory whenever they want, if there's evidence of an outbreak. Because this tendency to cover up that we see in China today, we saw in Guinea with the Ebola outbreak, we saw it in Syria with polio, we see it around the world with cholera. It's very common for governments to cover up. And the US can help to strengthen the WHO's ability to investigate. The other thing I think that they can do is really to learn from the UN Human Rights Council. And that is to say, WHO is not in a position where it can criticize its funders. And it was a bit of an unfair criticism of the WHO that, Tedros wouldn't criticize China because China is such a powerful player. But the US could help set up an independent panel that would be able to criticize governments that don't cooperate with international health regulation requirements. And I think that too would be the kind of thing that would strengthen the medical architecture, the public health architecture, in a way that allows WHO to emerge from this more strongly or stronger than it has going into it.
Thanks, Ken. A question from Paul Gray. Can you please comment on the recent actions by social media companies to censor individuals such as US President Trump?
Yes. Well, I should begin by saying I think they did the right thing, probably belatedly. But, social media companies, like any company, have a duty to avoid complicity in human rights violations. And Trump was openly using the platforms, particularly Twitter, to promote his mob, including white supremacists, to attack the Capitol. He was applauding, white supremacists in Charlottesville on up to the present. This was an ongoing problem. We see a threat of this in state capitals today, on Inauguration Day on January 20th. So I think the social media companies just recognize that they warned Trump, but he proved to be incorrigible, and they could no longer afford to be complicit in these violent attacks on democracy and on basic rights. But I don't want to stop there because it's not that simple. I think we have to recognize that these platforms have become, in many ways, the public domain. This is where a lot of conversation takes place. Now, I don't feel sorry for Trump. He can still hold a press conference tomorrow in the White House. He's got his voice, but many people don't. And so I think we have to think about what are ways that we can ensure that the big platforms use their power appropriately in a principled way. One thing is frankly to reduce their monopoly. I think we have to ask, why is it that Facebook, holds Instagram? Why does Google own YouTube? I mean, more of a diversification of platforms would make it harder for, one platform to have so much of a censoring effect. But we also need to have some kind of appeal mechanism set up. And I don't favor government regulation here. That introduces more problems than it solves. But the platforms can set up independent bodies that are not answerable to the CEO that can decide whether the principles have been applied fairly or not. And so if I'm kicked off Twitter, I can appeal to somebody and I can have a fair hearing that doesn't depend on what Jack Dorsey thinks about that. I think it's also important to recognize that we're all very focused on Trump right now, but these platforms are very powerful around the world. The same day that Twitter and Facebook were cutting off Trump, there was an appeal in Myanmar for Facebook to stop allowing the Myanmar military to recruit soldiers through its platform, who in turn would be used to persecute ethnic minorities. And there clearly is a need by the platforms to invest much more in the linguistic and cultural capacity to be able to understand what's going on in different countries, where Facebook or Twitter, these platforms can be in many ways the internet. They can be a very important source of public discourse and can be greatly abused if they're not closely monitored.
Ken, there's a question from Atalanti Moquette, which is a little bit of a follow-up to something that you talked about earlier, but asks, in terms of putting pressure on China, returning to China, how can businesses be made responsible to do due diligence in their supply chains?
Well, I think that the problem is if we just leave it up to the businesses, then the businesses that are big global names that are worried about their reputation are going to be forced to be diligent because they can't afford to be seen as importing the product of forced labor. But there are many countries that flow below the radar screen, and they will ignore due diligence requirements unless they're forced to abide by them. And that's why I think in this realm, legislation, mandatory requirements are essential. And many governments are moving in this direction. And the question is really increasingly, how strong should these due diligence requirements be? And it's important that it not be sufficient to say, oh, I just look one layer down in my supply chain, but how can I possibly know what's going on below that? That's not an answer. There really has to be pressure on these companies to open up their supply chain overall. And one way to do that, frankly, is to stop treating supply chains as a trade secret, to make them completely transparent so that local activists, local media, local trade unions can alert us if there's a problem. And then when you have a place like Xinjiang, which is just a black hole at this point, where no independent scrutiny is allowed, and where there's considerable evidence of forced labor, then the presumption has got to be that every product is infected until China proves otherwise. And that kind of strong legislation would go a long way toward, not only reducing corporate complicity in these kind of abuses, but most important, reducing the abuses themselves.
Thanks. There's a question from Twitter on Brazil, which I will put to you and also to Jose Miguel, who is going to be leaving the call shortly because he has to start off his Latin America call at the top of the hour. So this question from Twitter is, in Brazil, President Bolsonaro has allowed criminal networks to carry out illegal deforestation in the Amazon. How can we stop the destruction of such a vital rainforest?
Okay, I'll start this and let Jose Miguel pick it up, I guess. First, the premise of the question is absolutely accurate. Bolsonaro has completely green-lighted these criminal cartels, which have been attacking forest defenders, the indigenous people, the local activists, even the official environmental regulators, and just going forth and utterly destroying the Amazon. And that, fortunately, has led to significant pushback. And the most significant source of pressure so far has been from the European Union. There is a trade deal that has been negotiated and agreed to, but not ratified, between, on the one hand, the European Union, and on the other hand, Mercosur, the South American trade bloc, of which Brazil is the largest member. And one of the terms of that trade deal is Brazil's got to stop deforestation of the Amazon. And European governments rightly say, we're not ratifying this until Bolsonaro stops this. And that is very significant pressure. Brazil wants this trade deal. So we've seen, some, I would say, so far largely token steps by Bolsonaro. He created a so-called Amazon Council to address deforestation. He deployed the military in the Amazon, but he has not made any real progress in reducing deforestation. And of course, part of that is that he had the benefit of a kindred president in the White House who also didn't care about deforestation, didn't care about climate change, and who embraced Bolsonaro because they shared so many tendencies. That's about to change. And we have a president now who is not going to cozy up to autocrats, but is going to clearly, definitively distance himself from them, and a president who cares deeply about climate change. So suddenly Washington is going to add its voice and its clout to that already being exercised in Europe. And this is going to be, a double whammy that I suspect Bolsonaro is going to feel. I certainly hope he does, because what's been going on in the Amazon is disastrous for the people of Brazil and potentially disastrous for the global effort to fight climate change.
Thanks. Moving to the other side of the world, we have a question. You mentioned the Ugandan elections, which are taking place tomorrow. But we have a question about repression in Uganda, what we have to say about the repression ahead of the general election, and then also what we think the US government could do there. So I don't know if you want to take that and then perhaps turn over to Sarah on what
Sure.
we expect the Biden administration to do, what we would want them to do.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, this has been a quite violent campaign, not because of campaigners, but because of the government. As I mentioned before, Museveni has used the pandemic as a pretext to try to shut down campaigning by his principal opponent, Bobi Wine. And his security forces have shot people. There have been scores of people killed. There have been widespread beatings. Bobi Wine's car himself has been attacked. He himself has been beaten. I mean, here's like the leading presidential candidate who runs around the country with a helmet and a bulletproof vest. That says it all. So Museveni is clearly terrified that he's going to lose, and is doing everything he can to change the rules, to game the system in the hope of announcing a victory tomorrow. Now, the US government, was hoping to deploy observers, electoral observers, but they just announced that Museveni's even blocking that. He's not giving them the accreditation that they need. Why would he block this if he wasn't, planning some real effort to steal the election? So, I think the question is going to come up, if Museveni doesn't allow a fair polling to go forward, what are the steps the US government can take? And I'll let Sarah address that.
Thanks, Ken. So I want to pull back into the big picture of what the U.S. can do in Uganda and lots of other places where we're seeing this kind of regression on human rights, and that's through its security assistance. So the United States offers security assistance around the world, including to human rights abusers, and hopes to gain some influence through that process. We've seen several nominees come forward from Biden who care deeply about Africa, including the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, the new ambassador to the US, the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, both of whom have very relevant experience in Africa and including on Uganda. And so whereas President Trump neglected the continent, we hope to see Biden put renewed interest in it. And of course, Uganda receives quite a lot of security assistance from the United States. one thing that Human Rights Watch wants to see across the board is human rights considerations, including patterns of behavior in the countries that the United States is giving security assistance to, considered in every decision to send weapons, arms, material, technology, training, and equipping.
Thanks, Sarah. Here's a good follow-up for you that's just come in from Twitter, which is, how will US foreign policy change under Biden, or how do we expect it to change, especially in the Middle East and the conflict in Yemen? And Ken can also jump in after.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of the nominees that Biden has put forward have questioned why the United States ever got involved in Yemen, particularly arming Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And of course, President Trump just put through Congress a major notification to give billions in F-35 fighter jets and armed drones to the United Arab Emirates that, of course, we want to see halted immediately and restarted only pending some sort of human rights review. We at Human Rights Watch have documented many violations of human rights in Yemen by the Saudi coalition. And so we're hoping to see that be one of the big changes in policy that the Biden administration takes immediately.
Thanks. And Ken, before you join in, if you want to, I'm being reminded that we should be speaking a little bit more slowly, please, so people can understand easily.
I'm always guilty of that. Let me, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to what Sarah said, other than that, we should remember that Congress already voted to cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And Trump, proceeded because he cared more about jobs than Yemeni civilian lives. And so I think that it's going to be relatively easy for Biden to move forward and cut those arms sales. The UAE is pulled out of the Saudi-led coalition. It now, these days, isn't engaged in the bombing, but it still is a key partner on the ground. Itself has still been responsible for torture and detention and the like. And of course, the UAE is a highly repressive government at home. So I hope that Biden takes the step with Saudi Arabia, but then looks more generally in the Middle East, because what you say about Saudi Arabia can be said just as much about UAE, about Egypt, about Israel. There are a number of candidates there who are beneficiaries of US military or arms largesse, who are using these weapons or their military to suppress rights in a very violent way.
Thank you. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to ask one last question. And Ken, I think this is for you and also for Nicole, Austin, Hillary. So you addressed Trump's support for, you talked about support for white supremacy, white extremism. So does Human Rights Watch have specific recommendations for what the Biden administration can do to address systemic racism in the United States?
Nicole, go ahead. I'll let you start. I'll pick up after that.
Thanks, Ken, and good morning, everyone. So just to be clear, when we talk about systemic racism, what we are talking about are policies and practices that exist that have the effect of impairing someone's basic rights to housing, education, healthcare, all of those practices and policies that would allow people to live freely and in an equitable environment. So we have many suggestions and recommendations, some of which we've already made to the Biden administration that we think can address all of these issues. And we all know and have lived through over the past few months around the world, in fact, this racial implosion around racial injustices. We specifically have made recommendations to the Biden administration and will continue to make recommendations about how we can change and improve policing in this country. And not just to change policing in terms of how they do their work, but to change the focus of what we mean when we talk about making communities safer. What we've heard from individuals around the country is that they want their governments to provide them with better housing, better education, better mental health care systems, and that they would like to see monies and focus go into those services so that there will be less of a need for policing. We know that in the United States, police have often been used to supplement needs in these other areas where they particularly aren't qualified. When communities have mental health needs, for instance, oftentimes police are called in when it would be far better to have mental health service providers provide those needs. We're also calling for the Biden administration to look at ways that we can provide more equitable educational opportunities. We've seen in the era of COVID that disparities have really shown themselves with respect to how at-home schooling and education has impacted Black and Brown communities in a very disparate way. We want to see more equality and a leveling of the playing field when it comes to those issues. So yes, we will continue to push the Biden administration in all of those key areas. And we think that will go a long way to helping to address the systemic racism that exists in the United States.
Ken, a last word?
Well, no, I mean, I think Nicole said that all very well. It's just worth stressing that, a lot of what is on Biden's agenda, which will help, low-income people across the board, would go a long way toward addressing the big disparities, racial disparities that Nicole describes. And so if he really succeeds in making healthcare available to everybody, that's a big step. If he really succeeds in ensuring kind of a minimum income, even if you've lost your job, that's big. That improves everybody's lives and goes a long way toward addressing some of the racial inequality that we've seen. And in the criminal justice realm, Nicole talked about policing, which is a big part of it. But we also have to focus on sentencing practices. We've got to get rid of mandatory minimum sentences. We got to get rid of a lot of nonviolent drug offenses. We've got to address America's infatuation with over-incarceration, which has a huge impact, particularly on Black males. And so there's not a single panacea here, but I think there is growing awareness of both the dimensions of the problem, but also what some of the steps are that need to be taken to solve them. And the good news is Biden seems to be open to a lot of this. Much of it is going to require ultimately legislation, and hopefully he will succeed in getting past the narrow divides in Congress and building a broader consensus around the absolute urgency of addressing some of these issues.
Thank you so much, Ken. And I think, as we've just seen these days, also protecting the right to vote, so important and so critical to ending systemic racism. So we're almost at the hour, and we're going to wrap up there. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody for participating with us today. And if we didn't get to your question, please email our press desk at hrwpress@hrw.org, and they will pass your question on to the relevant person at Human Rights Watch. We're dropping that address in the chat as well. HRW Press, the press desk, can also share with you the press releases we've put out today and video sound bites from Ken summarizing his introduction today. We also have sound bites, both video and text, from 4 human rights defenders that we work closely with. And we asked them to give us their thoughts about the importance of international attention, focusing international attention on human rights, and also suggestions for what they want Joe Biden to do in his first term. So check those out on our social media feeds. And if you want copies to use, then contact HRW Press. And please all follow us on Twitter and Instagram. If you search, you'll find Human Rights Watch is present in numerous languages. And visit us at our website at hrw.org. So once again, thank you all for participating. And here's hoping that 2021 will be and see a much more rights-respecting world for all of us.